Those ancient fishing privileges died with your great-grandfather, old man. We're exercising community authority to establish modern recreational access for all Clearwater Estates residents instead of letting one family monopolize our premium waterfront. That's what Marcus Whitfield announced while standing in his signature pink dress shirt and black dress pants on the sacred gravel bank where my great-great-grandfather, Standing Bear, had cast nets under federal treaty protection since 1887. Clipboard pressed against his chest like a shield while pointing at the crystalline waters that had sustained 5 generations of my family. The morning air carried the scent of pine needles and ancient river stones, while Marcus's voice echoed across the surface that had reflected my ancestors' faces for over 135 years. His pink dress shirt gleaming with the kind of entitlement that thinks expensive clothing grants authority over federal treaty rights and constitutional protections that predate his precious HOA by 8 decades. The sweet irony was that Marcus's clipboard contained fake expiration notices, while my briefcase held something that would make his $120 million waterfront development disappear from federal maps forever. My U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service director credentials and the exclusive regulatory authority to revoke every fishing license, boat permit, and waterway access authorization serving his community with one executive order from Washington. ONM Director Thomas Blackhorse, senior U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service official and former federal treaty rights enforcement specialist, and I stood there watching Marcus claim ownership of waters protected by federal treaty while calculating navigation violations, treaty interference charges, and the federal penalties that would make his pink dress shirt a prison uniform within months. What Marcus didn't know, while he declared my ancestral fishing rights expired, was that every boat launch, fishing license, and waterway access permit in his development operated under federal authorizations I controlled through 40 years of wildlife management and treaty enforcement expertise. His fishing rights seizure wasn't just harassment, it was systematic violation of federal treaty protections that would trigger Fish and Wildlife Enforcement, FBI civil rights investigation, and federal prosecutors who specialized in protecting Native American treaty rights from suburban terrorists in pink dress shirts. The beautiful irony was that Marcus's treaty violation would become the catalyst for his complete annihilation when federal agents arrested him for interfering with protected treaty rights, while I demonstrated exactly what happens when HOA presidents forget that some waters are governed by Washington treaties, not homeowner associations. In 6 weeks, his pink dress shirt would be replaced with orange prison clothing, while federal judges sentenced him to decades in prison for crimes against America's indigenous heritage and the constitutional protections that defend treaty rights from clipboard tyrants who mistake expensive clothing for federal authority. What would you do if the HOA claimed your family's ancestral fishing rights were expired and tried seizing waters protected by federal treaty for over 135 years? Where are you watching from? Drop your state below because this story will teach you exactly how federal treaty law works, which agencies prosecute treaty interference, and the specific legal strategies that turn clipboard authority into federal terrorism charges when pink dress shirt tyrants forget that some rights were negotiated with the United States government itself, not homeowner associations. After 40 years protecting America's wildlife resources and enforcing federal treaty rights that preserve indigenous access to traditional fishing grounds, I'd earned my peaceful retirement on the 100-acre homestead my family had owned since the 1887 Treaty of Medicine Creek established our exclusive fishing rights in perpetuity. The property sat on the shores of the Clearwater River in northern Montana, where crystal-clear waters reflected snow-capped peaks and supported native trout populations that had sustained my people for generations before European settlement brought homeowner associations and pink dress shirt tyranny to our traditional territories. The morning air smelled like sage and river willows, while ancient granite boulders bore pictographs that marked our fishing stations, creating the perfect setting for the traditional fish camp where I planned to teach my grandson Miguel the sustainable harvest practices that had kept our river healthy for centuries. The fishing rights themselves were masterpieces of 19th-century federal treaty negotiation, established through the Treaty of Medicine Creek that guaranteed my family's exclusive access to specific fishing grounds in exchange for ceding thousands of acres to territorial development. Great-great-grandfather Standing Bear had negotiated personally with federal commissioners, ensuring his descendants would always have access to the waters that had fed our people since time immemorial. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had recognized our treaty fishing station in 1934, providing federal protection under treaty enforcement regulations that guaranteed our rights regardless of local development, state interference, or municipal ignorance of constitutional law. My traditional fishing operation used techniques passed down through generations of indigenous knowledge that predated European methods by centuries. The stone fish weirs my ancestors had built channeled salmon runs while maintaining sustainable populations, and the cedar drying racks great-grandfather had constructed still served our family's subsistence needs. Federal wildlife biologists regularly studied our traditional methods, recognizing them as modern sustainable resource management that modern fishery science was only beginning to understand. Then Clearwater Estates sprouted around the river's pristine banks like an expensive suburban infection. 347 McMansions with manicured lawns and enough HOA regulations to choke a federal treaty library. The development's marketing promised exclusive riverfront lifestyle and unparalleled recreational fishing access, promises that directly threatened the treaty-protected waters my family had stewarded for generations. Marcus Whitfield arrived in Clearwater Estates like a corporate virus wearing expensive clothing and delusions of authority over federal treaty law. Recently retired from some natural resources executive position where he'd apparently spent decades exploiting the same federal lands he now wanted to control for aesthetic reasons, Marcus wore his pink dress shirt and black dress pants like a uniform of suburban conquest. During HOA meetings, he spoke in buzzwords about waterfront optimization and recreational equity, code language for eliminating indigenous treaty rights through legal terrorism disguised as community development. Marcus's obsession with my fishing rights began during his first month as HOA president, when he declared my traditional fishing camp a monolithic resource that should serve his development's recreational needs instead of honoring federal treaty obligations that had been ratified by Congress and upheld by the Supreme Court. The first warning shot came via certified mail, claiming my fishing rights had expired through non-use and could be reassigned to community benefit through authority he didn't possess under federal law, constitutional protection, or basic human decency. The sweet irony was that Marcus's clipboard contained fake expiration notices, while my briefcase held something that would make his $120 million waterfront development disappear from federal maps forever. My U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service director credentials and the exclusive regulatory authority to revoke every fishing license, boat permit, and waterway access authorization serving his community with one executive order from Washington. I'm Director Thomas Blackhorse, Senior U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service official and former Federal Treaty Rights Enforcement Specialist, and I stood there watching Marcus claim ownership of waters protected by federal treaty while calculating navigation violations, treaty interference charges, and the federal penalties that would make his pink dress shirt a prison uniform within months. What Marcus didn't know, while he declared my ancestral fishing rights expired, was that every boat launch, fishing license, and waterway access permit in his development operated under federal authorizations I controlled through 40 years of wildlife management and treaty enforcement expertise. His fishing rights seizure wasn't just harassment, it was systematic violation of federal treaty protections that would trigger Fish and Wildlife Enforcement, FBI civil rights investigation, and federal prosecutors who specialized in protecting Native American treaty rights from suburban terrorists in pink dress shirts. The beautiful irony was that Marcus's treaty violation would become the catalyst for his complete annihilation when federal agents arrested him for interfering with protected treaty rights, while I demonstrated exactly what happens when HOA presidents forget that some waters are governed by Washington treaties, not homeowner associations. In 6 weeks, his pink dress shirt would be replaced with orange prison clothing, while federal judges sentenced him to decades in prison for crimes against America's indigenous heritage and the constitutional protections that defend treaty tyrants who mistake expensive clothing for federal authority. What would you do if the HOA claimed your family's ancestral fishing rights were expired and tried seizing waters protected by federal treaty for over 135 years? Marcus's escalation peaked when he hired waterfront consultants to assess my fishing grounds for community recreational optimization. 3 unlicensed contractors whose expertise consisted of measuring traditional structures they couldn't understand, while Marcus supervised from his air-conditioned BMW, his pink dress shirt pressed crisp as his arrogance. Their assessment recommended removing exclusive fishing structures, installing modern recreational facilities, and creating equitable waterfront access that would eliminate my treaty rights while violating federal protections established through congressional ratification and presidential signature. The morning sun caught the fabric of his pink dress shirt as he gestured dismissively at ancient pictographs that marked sacred fishing stations, treating thousand-year-old cultural heritage like graffiti that needed removal for suburban aesthetics. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a federal treaty law specialist I'd worked with during my fish and wildlife enforcement career, reviewed Marcus's modification proposals with professional horror that bordered on constitutional outrage. Thomas, these modifications would systematically destroy federally protected treaty fishing rights while violating Supreme Court precedent that has protected indigenous fishing access for over a century, she reported, while examining plans that showed Marcus's complete ignorance of federal treaty law and constitutional protections. He's recommending changes that would constitute willful interference with protected treaty operations, creating federal violations that carry substantial criminal penalties under civil rights and treaty protection statutes that were written specifically to prevent this kind of cultural genocide. But Marcus's biggest mistake was underestimating who he was attacking. A simple internet search would have revealed my 40-year career protecting federal wildlife resources, my current position as U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Director with exclusive authority over waterway management, and my direct control over the environmental permits and fishing licenses that kept his precious Clearwater estates connected to recreational fishing and federal waterway access that could be terminated with one phone call to Washington. The Clearwater River wasn't just my family's traditional fishing ground, it was federally designated as both a wild and scenic river and a critical habitat for endangered salmon species that triggered multiple layers of federal protection. These designations carried enforcement authority that I personally controlled, making Marcus's treaty violation a direct attack on someone with the power to shut down his entire development through environmental protection statutes. My professional response was methodical and devastating, beginning with a formal complaint to the Fish and Wildlife Treaty Enforcement Division that documented every violation while Marcus watched from his BMW, pink dress shirt reflecting in the windshield like a beacon of his impending federal prosecution. I contacted Fish and Wildlife Treaty Protection Director Rebecca Torres, a no-nonsense administrator who'd spent 20 years enforcing regulations that keep federal treaty obligations sacred and constitutionally protected from exactly the kind of suburban terrorism Marcus represented. Director Blackhorse, this represents systematic targeting of federally protected treaty fishing rights and critical salmon habitat, she confirmed after reviewing my documentation, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd prosecuted treaty violation cases across multiple states and tribal territories. Your fishing rights operate under federal treaty protection that takes precedent over all local ordinances, state regulations, and homeowner association delusions. Marcus's activities constitute willful obstruction under treaty protection statutes that carry decades in federal prison for anyone stupid enough to interfere with constitutionally guaranteed indigenous rights. Special Agent David Rodriguez from the FBI's Civil Rights and Environmental Crimes Unit coordinated federal response with surgical precision that would have impressed military strategists. Director Blackhorse, your fishing rights are protected under federal treaty, and your river is designated critical habitat for endangered species, he explained during our secure briefing at the local FBI field office. Treaty documents and environmental protection maps spread across a conference table that smelled like fresh coffee and impending constitutional justice. Marcus isn't just committing harassment, he's planning systematic violation of multiple federal protection statutes that constitute domestic terrorism under civil rights laws written specifically to prosecute attacks on indigenous constitutional protections and endangered species habitat. Dr. Evan Reed's forensic analysis of Marcus's HOA finances revealed systematic embezzlement through shell companies and kickback schemes designed to fund his monument to recreational tyranny while enriching his family through fraudulent waterfront development contracts. $900,000 stolen through inflated contractor invoices and fake environmental assessments, Reed reported while spreading evidence across my kitchen table, morning light illuminating financial crimes that would make federal judges reach for maximum sentences under both embezzlement and civil rights violation statutes. Marcus used phantom waterfront studies to justify unnecessary spending, then laundered money through his brother's marine construction company while residents paid for systematic violation of federally protected treaty rights and endangered species habitat. The first test of Marcus's criminal stupidity came when federal fish and wildlife agents arrived for routine monitoring of my protected fishing operations, only to find Marcus's contractors had already begun preliminary site modification that included disturbing salmon spawning beds and removing traditional fish weirs with heavy machinery that left diesel exhaust hanging over sacred waters like industrial desecration. The federal agents immediately called FBI environmental crime specialists, who arrived to find Marcus directing operations from his BMW while wearing his pink dress shirt like a uniform of treaty violation and environmental destruction, completely oblivious to the multiple federal crimes he was committing in broad daylight. Marcus's response to federal investigation revealed his complete disconnection from constitutional law and basic respect for America's indigenous heritage. Standing in his pink dress shirt at an emergency HOA meeting while claiming his recreational development would modernize outdated fishing privileges and create democratic waterfront access that superseded federal treaty protections established through congressional ratification and constitutional guarantee. The meeting was recorded by residents, creating audio evidence of Marcus's callous disregard for constitutional protections and federal environmental law that prosecutors would present to juries who understood the sacred nature of treaty rights and the criminal penalties for violating both indigenous heritage and endangered species protection. Meanwhile, I quietly activated the nuclear option Marcus had handed me through his treaty and environmental violations. As Fish and Wildlife Service Director, I had direct authority over the waterway permits that enabled every form of recreation in his development, plus environmental compliance that kept his entire community from violating endangered species protections. The boat launches, fishing licenses, and waterway infrastructure serving Clearwater Estates all operated under federal authorizations that could be suspended immediately for violations of treaty protection law and interference with critical habitat that I personally managed. The federal investigation accelerated when Fish and Wildlife Treaty Enforcement specialists discovered Marcus had been systematically researching other indigenous fishing rights throughout Montana. His computer files containing elimination reports and seizure proposals targeting 27 additional treaty-protected fishing operations across 6 tribal territories. His pink dress shirt had become a familiar sight at traditional fishing stations where he'd posed for photographs while calculating recreational potential and elimination costs of constitutionally protected treaty rights that had been guaranteed through federal negotiation and congressional ratification, apparently building a business model around cultural genocide disguised as community development. Dr. James Wilson, a federal treaty protection specialist who'd prosecuted indigenous rights violations across the Northwest, analyzed Marcus's elimination plans with professional horror that transformed into prosecutorial determination worthy of constitutional protection enforcement. This represents coordinated attack on federally protected treaty fishing rights and critical endangered species habitat disguised as recreational development, he testified during preliminary hearings, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen the consequences of allowing treaty violations to go unpunished by federal law enforcement. Mr. Whitfield has systematically targeted constitutionally protected indigenous fishing operations while using fraudulent environmental assessments to legitimize commercial elimination of federal treaty rights and salmon spawning habitat for suburban amenities and personal profit. The civil lawsuits began immediately after Marcus's federal arrest, with tribal nations, indigenous rights organizations, and environmental protection groups filing damages claims against Marcus, his HOA board, and every contractor involved in his treaty violation conspiracy that had threatened constitutional protections and endangered species habitat established through federal law and defended by generations of Americans who understood the price of cultural preservation. Attorney Sarah Chen argued that Marcus's deliberate targeting of protected treaty rights and critical habitat constituted federal terrorism warranting punitive damages exceeding his personal assets and HOA treasury combined, while seeking injunctive relief that would permanently protect both indigenous heritage and salmon populations from future suburban development threats. Marcus's desperate final gambit was attempting to claim recreational equity authority for his fishing rights seizure project, filing emergency motions arguing his development would modernize antiquated fishing privileges and enhance salmon habitat through recreational management that superseded federal treaty protections and endangered species designations established through constitutional guarantee and environmental science. The legal theory was so absurd it violated basic constitutional principles protecting treaty rights, indigenous sovereignty, and federal environmental law. But Marcus pressed forward with motions that became evidence of his systematic, criminal intent to profit from both cultural genocide and environmental destruction while wearing his pink dress shirt like a uniform of constitutional contempt. The FBI's financial investigation revealed Marcus's treaty and environmental violations had been funded through systematic embezzlement from HOA reserves, inflated contractor invoices, and kickback schemes involving his brother's marine construction company that specialized in indigenous rights elimination and habitat destruction for commercial waterfront projects. Special Agent Rodriguez discovered Marcus had stolen $2.3 million from community funds to build his monument to recreational tyranny while creating systematic liability for federal treaty violation and endangered species destruction that could trigger tribal sovereignty investigations, environmental protection enforcement, and congressional oversight hearings. The catastrophic test came during spring salmon runs when Marcus's construction crew began actual modification of my traditional fishing weirs, using heavy machinery that destroyed spawning beds and contaminated critical habitat with diesel fuel and construction debris, creating exactly the kind of environmental disaster that federal prosecutors had been preparing to prevent through maximum enforcement. Federal treaty protection agents and environmental crime specialists responded immediately, arriving to find Marcus directing operations from his BMW while his contractors systematically destroyed both protected treaty infrastructure and endangered salmon habitat with bulldozers and excavators that treated constitutional guarantees and environmental protection like commercial construction obstacles. The treaty and environmental violations were halted by federal court order, but the damage was irreversible and documented by federal crime scene technicians who photographed every damaged fish weir, contaminated spawning bed, and destroyed cultural site for prosecution exhibits that would demonstrate Marcus's willful violation of constitutional protections and federal environmental law. Traditional fishing structures that had served my family for generations had been damaged by Marcus's machinery. Sacred grounds had been violated by commercial development, and critical salmon habitat had been contaminated by construction equipment that treated federal protections as obstacles to suburban recreational development. Marcus's pink dress shirt was now stained with the sacred waters and salmon blood he had spilled for his personal profit, creating visual evidence that federal prosecutors would use to demonstrate his callous disregard for constitutional protections, indigenous heritage, and environmental stewardship that form the foundation of American treaty obligations and species protection laws. But the real devastation came when I implemented the complete shutdown Marcus had unknowingly triggered through his multiple federal violations. As Fish and Wildlife Service Director, I had documented sufficient evidence of systematic destruction of both treaty-protected fishing rights and critical endangered species habitat to justify emergency enforcement action against all recreational activities within the Clearwater Estates development. The first domino fell when the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers received my enforcement recommendation and immediately issued a permanent cease and desist order for all waterfront activities within the development, citing unpermitted destruction of both treaty-protected cultural sites and federally designated critical habitat. The Corps, facing potential loss of their federal operating authority for allowing such violations, immediately complied by halting all recreational access to the river, effectively eliminating the primary selling point of Marcus's $120 million development. Next, the Environmental Protection Agency issued similar orders regarding water quality violations and unpermitted discharges into critical salmon habitat, while the National Marine Fisheries Service suspended all fishing permits for the area pending restoration of damaged spawning beds. Rather than risk federal sanctions that could destroy their agencies, all environmental regulators coordinated a complete shutdown of recreational access that left Marcus's waterfront community high and dry. Within 48 hours, Marcus's $120 million development was effectively cut off from the river, which had been its primary attraction. No fishing, no boating, no waterfront recreation, just expensive houses with worthless river views and federal investigators documenting environmental crimes that would send their HOA president to prison for decades while bankrupting every homeowner who'd supported his cultural genocide and habitat destruction enterprise. The FBI's financial investigation revealed Marcus's treaty and environmental violations had been funded through systematic embezzlement from HOA reserves, inflated contractor invoices, and kickback schemes involving his brother's marine construction company that specialized in indigenous rights elimination and habitat destruction for commercial waterfront projects. Special Agent Rodriguez discovered Marcus had stolen $2.3 million from community funds to build his monument to recreational tyranny, while creating systematic liability for federal treaty violation and endangered species destruction that could trigger tribal sovereignty investigations, environmental protection enforcement, and congressional oversight hearings. The catastrophic test came during spring salmon runs when Marcus's construction crew began actual modification of my traditional fishing weirs, using heavy machinery that destroyed spawning beds and contaminated critical habitat with diesel fuel and construction debris, creating exactly the kind of environmental disaster that federal prosecutors had been preparing to prevent through maximum enforcement and criminal penalties. Federal treaty protection agents and environmental crime specialists responded immediately, arriving to find Marcus directing operations from his BMW while his contractors systematically destroyed both protected treaty infrastructure and endangered salmon habitat with bulldozers and excavators that treated constitutional guarantees and environmental protection like commercial construction obstacles. The treaty and environmental violations were halted by federal court order, but the damage was irreversible and documented by federal crime scene technicians who photographed every damaged fish weir, contaminated spawning bed, and destroyed cultural site for prosecution exhibits that would demonstrate Marcus's willful violation of constitutional protections and federal environmental law. Traditional fishing structures that had served my family for generations had been damaged by Marcus's machinery. Sacred grounds had been violated by commercial development, and critical salmon habitat had been contaminated by construction equipment that treated federal protections as obstacles to suburban recreational development. Marcus's pink dress shirt was now stained with the sacred waters and the federal trial began with media coverage that transformed Marcus's pink dress shirt into a national symbol of cultural genocide and environmental terrorism. His image broadcast across every major network as prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of systematic treaty violation, constitutional rights interference, and endangered species destruction that had attacked both America's indigenous heritage and critical salmon habitat for recreational profit, while enriching Marcus's family through embezzled community funds and fraudulent development contracts that violated every principle of federal treaty protection and environmental stewardship. Marcus's defense crumbled under cross-examination, revealing his complete ignorance of federal treaty law, constitutional protections, environmental regulations, and basic respect for America's indigenous heritage and endangered species that form the foundation of both cultural preservation and ecological sustainability, established through congressional ratification, Supreme Court precedent, and scientific consensus. Wearing standard business clothing instead of his signature pink dress shirt, Marcus appeared diminished and pathetic, while prosecutors played recordings of him defending his treaty elimination and habitat destruction during active federal investigation procedures, his voice carrying the kind of callous disregard for constitutional protections and environmental stewardship that made jurors visibly angry at his systematic attack on American values. Fish and Wildlife Treaty Protection Director Rebecca Torres delivered testimony that ended Marcus's defense permanently, her professional authority carrying the weight of 30 years protecting America's treaty rights and endangered species from commercial exploitation and systematic destruction. Mr. Whitfield's actions represent the most egregious violation of both federal treaty protection and endangered species law I've encountered in 20 years of indigenous rights and environmental enforcement, she stated, while prosecutors displayed photographs of damaged fishing structures, contaminated spawning beds, and destroyed cultural sites that showed the real-world consequences of Marcus's criminal enterprise. His elimination project was specifically designed to profit from violation of both constitutionally protected treaty rights and critical salmon habitat, creating systematic violation of federal laws written to honor America's treaty obligations and preserve endangered species for future generations who depend on both cultural survival and ecological sustainability. Dr. Sarah Martinez's constitutional and environmental law analysis demonstrated how Marcus's elimination project violated every principle of both treaty protection and species conservation established by congressional ratification, Supreme Court precedent, and environmental science that had been upheld for over a century of federal protection policy. This represents systematic violation of both constitutionally protected federal treaty rights and critical endangered species habitat disguised as recreational development, she testified, while reviewing technical specifications that showed Marcus's systematic planning to destroy both cultural heritage and ecological resources for suburban amenities. Marcus engineered commercial elimination of both constitutional guarantees and environmental protections that prioritized recreational facilities over honoring federal treaty obligations and preserving salmon populations that form the foundation of both indigenous cultural survival and Pacific Northwest ecosystem health. The financial evidence presented by FBI forensic accountants revealed Marcus had systematically embezzled HOA funds while enriching family members through inflated contractor invoices and kickback schemes designed to profit from both cultural genocide and environmental destruction that violated federal law and dishonored American constitutional obligations to indigenous peoples and endangered species protection. Special Agent Rodriguez testified about discovering $2.3 million in stolen community funds, fake environmental assessments used to justify both treaty elimination and habitat destruction, and shell companies designed to launder money through Marcus's brother's construction business that specialized in both indigenous rights violation and environmental crimes for commercial development. Tribal representatives and environmental scientists delivered heartbreaking victim impact statements that demonstrated the human and ecological cost of Marcus's systematic destruction enterprise. Tribal Chairman James Standing Bear described how Marcus's treaty violation had damaged 5 generations of family fishing tradition while destroying salmon habitat that sustained both cultural practices and ecosystem health, explaining how the constitutional and environmental violations had threatened both cultural survival and species recovery that could never be restored if treaty protections and critical habitat were eliminated through commercial development. Marine biologist Dr. Emily Rodriguez testified about the irreversible damage to salmon spawning beds that had taken decades to restore after previous environmental disasters, emphasizing how Marcus's recreational development had set back both species recovery and ecosystem restoration by generations. The prosecution's closing argument was devastating in its constitutional authority, environmental science, and moral precision, with Assistant U.S. Attorney Robert King explaining how Marcus's crimes represented fundamental attacks on both American constitutional values and ecological sustainability that demanded maximum federal punishment under laws written to protect both indigenous rights and endangered species from exactly the kind of systematic exploitation Marcus had committed for personal profit and suburban recreational development. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Marcus Whitfield didn't just steal money or violate HOA regulations, King stated, while gesturing toward photographs of damaged treaty structures, contaminated habitat, and Marcus's pink dress shirt evidence. He systematically violated both constitutionally protected federal treaty rights and critical endangered species habitat while embezzling community funds to profit from elimination of both indigenous constitutional protections and salmon populations that form the foundation of Pacific Northwest cultural and ecological heritage. Federal Judge Patricia Morrison delivered Marcus's fate with gravity reserved for those who attack both America's constitutional foundations and environmental heritage while dishonoring federal treaty obligations and species protection for personal profit and recreational development that violated every principle of constitutional law and environmental stewardship. Mr. Whitfield, you systematically violated both constitutionally protected federal treaty rights and critical endangered species habitat while embezzling community funds to profit from commercial elimination of both indigenous constitutional protections and salmon populations that form the foundation of Pacific Northwest cultural and ecological heritage. The sentence was devastating and appropriate for someone who'd attacked both America's constitutional foundations and ecological heritage. 26 years in federal prison, complete asset forfeiture totaling $6.2 million, and restitution exceeding $28 million to tribal nations, environmental restoration funds, and salmon habitat recovery programs that would repair the damage Marcus's constitutional and environmental violations had caused to both protected indigenous rights and critical species habitat. Marcus's recreational development was permanently dismantled by federal marshals using controlled explosives that symbolically destroyed his monument to both cultural genocide and environmental terrorism, while restoring my family's ancestral fishing grounds to their rightful purpose, honoring federal treaty protections and preserving critical salmon habitat for future generations who depend on both constitutional guarantees for cultural survival and healthy ecosystems for species recovery. My great-great-grandfather's fishing weirs remained exactly where they belonged, on treaty-protected waters, serving their traditional mission of sustainable harvest, defended by the same federal laws that had sent Marcus to prison for attempting to profit from both constitutional violation and environmental destruction, while dishonoring American treaty obligations and endangered species protection for suburban recreational amenities. The restoration project became a national model for both treaty rights protection and salmon habitat recovery that attracted support from tribal nations, environmental organizations, constitutional law groups, and federal agencies committed to protecting America's indigenous heritage and endangered species from commercial exploitation and systematic destruction. Fish and wildlife specialists, treaty protection experts, tribal sovereignty organizations, and marine biologists collaborated to repair damage Marcus's development had caused to both cultural sites and critical habitat, while enhancing protection for similar operations nationwide through improved federal oversight and enhanced criminal penalties for both constitutional violation and environmental crimes. The fishing grounds were rededicated with full tribal ceremony, combined with scientific habitat restoration in a celebration attended by hundreds of tribal members, environmental scientists, constitutional law experts, and government officials who understood the sacred nature of both treaty rights and species protection Marcus had tried to eliminate for his personal profit and recreational development. The ceremony included traditional songs, federal treaty readings, salmon blessing rituals, and speeches by fish and wildlife officials who emphasized the importance of protecting both America's constitutional obligations and endangered species habitat from commercial exploitation, cultural genocide, and environmental terrorism. Marcus Whitfield remains incarcerated in high-security federal prison, his appeals exhausted, early release requests consistently denied by federal judges who recognize both constitutional violation and environmental destruction as unforgivable attacks on American treaty heritage, indigenous rights, and species protection that form the foundation of both federal-tribal relations and ecological sustainability. Prison officials report he remains unrepentant, still blaming others for his downfall, convinced he was unfairly prosecuted for improving recreational amenities while showing no understanding of either constitutional protections or environmental stewardship, no respect for treaty rights that preserve indigenous cultural survival, and no comprehension of species protection laws that maintain ecological health for future generations. This attitude ensures he'll serve his full 26-year sentence, while America's treaty obligations and endangered species remain protected by federal law and defended by Americans who understand that both constitutional guarantees and environmental protections are sacred trusts, not recreational opportunities for pink dress shirt tyrants who mistake expensive clothing for authority over federal treaty protections, indigenous constitutional rights, and critical species habitat that require federal protection from commercial terrorism and environmental destruction. The broader impact extended far beyond Montana waters, as the federal prosecution became a landmark case setting legal precedents for prosecuting HOA officials who target both constitutionally protected treaty rights and critical endangered species habitat, while engaging in systematic violation of indigenous constitutional protections and environmental laws for commercial development. The Black Horse Treaty and Habitat Protection Act, new federal legislation inspired by this case, now mandates enhanced penalties for both constitutional violation and environmental destruction, while strengthening Fish and Wildlife Enforcement Authority and providing additional resources for protecting both treaty rights and critical habitat from commercial exploitation and systematic destruction. For anyone facing similar attacks on treaty-protected rights or critical habitat, the lessons are crystal clear and both constitutionally and environmentally actionable. First, document everything meticulously. Every letter, email, threat, and violation incident involving both cultural heritage and environmental destruction. Because federal agencies take both treaty rights and species protection seriously and respond with full investigative authority when provided with comprehensive evidence of both constitutional violation and environmental crimes. Second, know your rights under both federal treaty law and environmental protection statutes, especially concerning indigenous fishing rights and critical habitat designations that provide powerful legal remedies against both cultural genocide and species destruction. Third, contact both Fish and Wildlife Service treaty enforcement and environmental crimes divisions immediately when HOAs threaten either protected cultural sites or critical habitat. Because federal specialists have exclusive authority to prosecute both constitutional violations and environmental destruction through agencies that can mobilize FBI investigation resources that local authorities cannot match for either civil rights or environmental crimes. Finally, never let fear prevent you from defending both constitutional protections and environmental heritage against commercial exploitation by pink dress shirt tyrants who think HOA authority supersedes both federal treaty guarantees and endangered species protections. Marcus thought his position made him untouchable, that he could violate both constitutionally protected treaty rights and critical salmon habitat while embezzling community funds with impunity, hiding behind expensive clothing and clipboard authority that meant nothing to federal prosecutors who specialize in protecting both indigenous constitutional rights and endangered species from exactly the kind of systematic exploitation Marcus represented through his cultural genocide and environmental terrorism enterprise. His 26-year federal prison sentence proves no one is above the law when they violate both America's constitutional foundations and environmental heritage, while dishonoring treaty obligations and species protection that preserve both indigenous cultural survival and ecological sustainability from exactly the kind of commercial terrorism Marcus systematically committed for personal profit and suburban recreational development that attacked both constitutional guarantees and environmental protections. 2 years later, I stood on my restored traditional fishing weirs, breathing air that smelled like clean water, sacred sage, and constitutional justice. While morning sunlight illuminated both ancient pictographs and recovering salmon runs that honored the federal guarantees Marcus had tried to eliminate for his personal profit and recreational development schemes. His treaty and environmental violations had been the catalyst for his complete destruction, proving that some rights flow deeper than suburban reed in both constitutional law and natural rivers, and that America's treaty obligations and species protection have federal defenders who will protect both indigenous constitutional protections and critical habitat from commercial exploitation, cultural genocide, and environmental terrorism. What would you do if the HOA claimed your family's treaty-protected fishing rights were expired while destroying endangered species habitat for recreational development? Share your constitutional and environmental protection story below. Your experience might help someone else defending America's treaty heritage and ecological resources from commercial exploitation and systematic destruction. Subscribe for more justice stories where pink dress shirt tyrants learn that some rights were negotiated with the United States government itself, while some habitats are protected by federal environmental law, and the price of violating both constitutional protections and species conservation is measured in decades behind federal prison bars.